Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In today's webinar, Regina Boyd will discuss how to minister to children and families who are suffering from trauma. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Parish and Curriculum Marketing Specialist at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions may be sent to our presenter using the questions section here of the GoToWebinar panel, and I'll read as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you tomorrow via email. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Regina Boyd is the founder of Boyd Counseling Services, a Catholic licensed mental health practice based in Orlando that provides in-person and virtual therapy for couples, families, and teens. She works with clients who are experiencing life changes, desire healthy emotional connection, and seek to develop problem-solving strategies within their relationships. Regina is a licensed marriage and family therapist and licensed mental health counselor. Regina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter.
All right.
And all right, we see your screen. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So today we are talking about how to minister to children and families who are experiencing trauma. So what I want you to do is imagine the most challenging person, dare I even say possibly annoying youth, family member, someone that you interact with in your ministry on a regular basis. Perhaps this is someone who is surrounded by drama or crisis. They make frequent complaints. Maybe there's somebody who has a tendency to be negative very often, maybe disrupting events that you've participated in or organized yourself, refuse to participate in events. I want you to think about this person and think about how you would respond to them. But first, before you do that, I want you to think about how Jesus would respond. How would Jesus view this person? How would he interact with him? What would be his response time and time again, interacting with this person, this challenging individual? And you can see here, I love the scripture verse of come to me, all you that are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest, because Jesus gives us that perfect example of who we're called to be. And there's a good chance that that challenging individual has experienced some type of trauma, believe it or not. I know there are some people, yes, there's always exceptions to every rule. There are some people who are just difficult to be difficult, but I would argue there's a very good chance they either have experienced or are currently experiencing some type of trauma in their past. And our role is to do what we can to see Jesus in those difficult moments, in those challenging moments, regardless of the situation. And if we can do that, if our hearts can be in that place, which I know we all ultimately strive for in our ministries, if we can do that, then we can become that resting place and helping those we minister to carry those burdens that they have. And so what we're going to do today is hopefully help you be better ministers, better teachers by the end of this time. I want you to have new skills and knowledge at the end of our time. I want to give you some encouragement in your ministry to know that you do make a difference, and you really might be the only person to make a difference in someone's life who has experienced trauma. Some understanding of trauma, getting a window into the life of what life might be like for people who experience trauma or have experienced it in the past. And then know how to support somebody, because oftentimes we are caring for someone for a certain period of time or ministering to them. And I want you to be able to feel confident moving forward by the end of their time, knowing what kind of plan to put into place should you encounter someone, or what to do in the future in an uncomfortable situation or a new situation. So, why are we talking about this? This quote that I mentioned before, from Matthew, we have that universal Christian call to take care of those who are suffering. And it kind of seems like it's a little bit of a prerequisite, if you will, to get into heaven. I'm not a theologian. I know there's probably lots of people on this webinar right now who have more theology training than I do, so feel free to correct me. But my understanding and my interpretation is that, we help heal and lift those burdens alongside Jesus. He gives us the grace to do that, to serve people, and we're called to bring consolation to those who are suffering. And so this is a really important topic. And I'm thinking back to one of my beloved pastors. He's no longer our pastor anymore. He got reassigned, but he used to pray during the prayers of the faithful in Mass. He used to say, for anyone experiencing illnesses not seen by the eye. And I really love that prayer because it's so easy for us to have compassion for someone who has a visible illness in some sense or some type of disability. And so in the same way, can we have compassion the same way we would respond to somebody who maybe isn't as able-bodied or whatever the situation may be? Can we also have that same compassion when it's not as visible? And then we want to be in a space where we're cultivating trust, removing obstacles that can get in the way of that, especially in regards to people's reception of the gospel. That's kind of why we're here, why we're in ministry in the first place, is we want people to know and grow in their love and relationship with the Lord. And so without that trust, people may be closed to that gospel. They might not be as willing to be open to it. And sometimes we don't realize that we could accidentally be adding to someone's trauma, compounding it, if we do anything to erode that trust in our relationship with those people we're ministering to, or add some negativity there. And I don't say that in a sense to put a lot of pressure on you and feel like you have to be on the lookout for every single thing that could be potentially traumatic. But all that to say is a reminder about how mindful are we being, that we want to make sure we're creating this sense of openness and establishing trust so that people will be open to the gospel and continue that faith journey and that faith walk. So let's talk about a definition of trauma. I really like this definition from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services of America organization. They are really focused on substance abuse, but I think it's a very important definition. I like their definition better than the American Psychological Association definition. So this is the one I pulled. So psychological trauma is harm or damage, harm to a person's mind as a result of one or more events that cause overwhelming amounts of stress that exceed the person's ability to cope or to integrate the emotions involved. And this can eventually lead to serious long-term consequences. This is really challenging. So I'll break it down a little bit more because it's kind of a big, vague, general term. What does that mean? I think we all know the example of war veterans, people who have experienced trauma close hand. They've seen explosions, they might have heard gunshots. There's been lots of scary situations, maybe where they were almost in danger of losing their life or witnessed someone else lose their life. And so those are really clear examples. I like to use those examples because they're very easy to highlight what a trauma could be. And so the first criteria is someone has to have experienced themselves or witnessed the traumatic event, like in the veteran example, or be exposed to traumatic information and experiences. So this is really common in people who are EMTs or medical personnel. They constantly hear information about stories that are traumatic, people who have been in various precarious situations. And so that can even in itself be a traumatic event. So you have to have experienced, witnessed, or been exposed to traumatic information. And then on top of that, when we talk about handling stress, for everyone, it's a little bit different. So just because you experience the traumatic event does not necessarily mean that that individual will become traumatized in the long term or have long-term serious effects from it. For example, we all know people who have served and toured in Iraq or Afghanistan, or many of us have. And so there are people probably that we know who have gone and come back, or we've heard stories and their lives are forever changed. And then there are people who have gone and come back and they come and live very normal lives. And so everyone has a different stress tolerance, and we just never know what that situation is that's going to influence somebody to the level of it being traumatic. Let me give you some more symptoms. It's almost kind of like the difference between a dump truck dumping sand on you, just gallons and gallons of sand, that one big climactic event, versus someone just pouring a tiny bucket of sand over on your head, one bucket every day for 10 years. So that's the difference between prolonged exposure to something, traumatic information perhaps, or one singular event. And then it can look like a lot of things. We've heard about flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, meaning thoughts that are not really your own. Somebody could be beating themselves up or just having thoughts about hurting themselves. Maybe they avoid triggers or reminders of their trauma. So for example, if you were trapped in an elevator, you might avoid taking the elevator for some time until you feel comfortable doing that again. Exaggerated negative beliefs can be really common. Thinking about, I'm bad, the world is dangerous. Negative emotion, inability to experience positive emotion, angry outbursts, sleep disturbances. So these are all things you want to be paying attention to. If you notice these behaviors in people that you're ministering to, it could be a sign of trauma. I'm not saying it automatically is, but these are some signs that you're definitely going to want to be paying attention to. And then on top of that, we never know when we could be triggering someone's trauma. What do I mean by trigger? You kind of, everything comes rushing back in that moment. So for example, the veteran who comes back home here to the US, they're hanging out, they're at their 3-year-old's birthday party, someone accidentally pops a balloon, and all of a sudden they're yelling and screaming, you know, hit the deck, everyone get out of here. And everyone's kind of thinking, what's going on? We're just at a birthday party. But the reality is they were triggered in that moment. The loud sound of the balloon popping brought them back to a dangerous place when they were in Afghanistan and there was gunshots and whatnot. And so that can happen in our day-to-day ministry, in our conversations. We never know what that situation is going to be when someone may be triggered or responding. Their body is having a visceral reaction to something that happened in the past, even though what's happening in the moment is not related or has anything to do with the trauma. It's almost like someone's carrying around a stack of poker chips and they're balancing it and doing the best they can. And then when that moment they get triggered, they all sort of fall, or it becomes a little unsteady, but maybe they can recuperate. It just sort of depends, again, on the situation. So where does trauma come from? In other words, how does this happen? How do people get it? We've sort of talked about some examples, and one of the main examples is through adverse childhood experiences. And trauma doesn't just only happen in childhood, but I think the adverse childhood experience list is really helpful for establishing those categories of what trauma looks like, how it comes about. And so this adverse childhood experience, if you're not familiar with it, they've done research on, I think, about 17,000 individuals over time, and they've been able to see, you know, if certain events happened in the past, were they more likely to engage in drug abuse? Were they more likely to maintain jobs and own a home and stable relationships in the future? So they followed people over time and found that people who experienced some of these adverse childhood experiences were more likely to end up having some negative impact on their life. Doesn't mean that automatically happens, but it was a very interesting study. So some of these categories that they discussed were physical abuse. So domestic violence can count as that. Bullying, I think, for our young people can count as physical abuse. Sexual abuse, emotional abuse, Cyberbullying, I would add in that as well. Physical neglect, emotional neglect, mental illness within the family. This is an interesting one that people don't often think about, but if a child were to have a parent who was experiencing severe OCD, for example, that child could be traumatized from their parents' extreme reactions to their own illness. So, for example, if a mom was really concerned about mold and engaging in a lot of cleaning rituals, being concerned if a child is cross-contaminating, playing with toys in one room and then touching another toy, and could they possibly transferring mold? Now all of a sudden, mom's concerns with OCD are now, she is now imposing rules to limit the child's behavior to help make sure that mold doesn't spread. Again, just as an example, and so you could imagine an extreme case how traumatic that could be for a child. So mom isn't intentionally harming her child, but sometimes when a family member experiences severe symptoms of mental illness, that can be traumatic for the family members as well. Bipolar is a common example there, schizophrenia, even depression. Separation and divorce can also be traumatic. Substance abuse, violence against a parent, and then maybe loss of a family member to jail or prison. So these are all things that I'm sure you've heard come up from time to time in your ministry, in your conversations with those people. So thinking again about the potential there for an impact into adulthood, or even they could be in the midst of that. I have a friend who is now a priest, and he, as people are in seminary and applying to go, apply, they have to get that psychological evaluation. And so he was sharing about, he had to share his life story with the psychologist and talked about his parents' divorce. And the psychologist said, "Oh, yeah, your parents divorced at this age or whatnot." And he said, "Yeah, but that didn't affect me. I'm fine." And the psychologist laughed at him and said, "Oh, it didn't affect you, but yet these were the same exact years when you started having behavior problems in school." And that was a really eye-opening experience for him because he thought he had dealt with it and moved on. And so a lot of times people have those same beliefs that something might have happened in their past, but it's been many years, they've moved on with their life. It's not something they think about day to day, but they don't realize how those signs show up. And so in the midst of your ministry, you might experience someone who has shown behavior problems, and they could be in the middle of some type of trauma. So let's take a moment to reflect. Based on what we've talked about so far, I want you to think of your students, if you're a teacher, teens, parents, whoever you minister to, how would you explain to a coworker, somebody, a ministry volunteer, or a parent, how exposure to stress can lead to trauma based on what we've talked about? And if you'd like, you can put that in the question box and just share some of your ideas. And maybe, Erin, if you don't mind reading a few examples, but how would you explain to someone, a parent, how exposure to stress can lead to trauma, just based on what we've talked about so far? There's no right or wrong answer here, so don't be afraid.
Okay, we've got some coming in here. Experiences that can cause radical disruptions in a person's normal everyday life that has lasting consequences.
Wow, very good.
Yeah. Exposure to stress can be like walking on eggshells.
Wow, beautiful image, yes.
Emotions can take over my logical reasoning.
Very true.
Let's see. We need to watch, listen carefully, could see a reaction or a trigger.
Yes.
I would use the example of a physical injury that seems like it has healed, but is unexpectedly weaker than expected. That's
Oh,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, that is interesting.
That we should listen to our children when their behavior suddenly changes.
Oh, yes, we are going to talk about that a little bit later. Yes. Very
Hmm.
good point. hmm
All right. I think that's about
Okay.
it.
Okay, great. So now let's talk about COVID, the beloved pandemic that we're still in the midst of in trauma. And I want to nuance this acute trauma versus chronic a bit more because I think it's worth spending some time talking about. So when we're talking acute, it's a one-time incident. It's one and done. So for example, a severe car accident, a robbery, a theft, and the event happens and then it's over. For chronic trauma, it's that long-term exposure to stress. So like we talked about before, for the definition of trauma, for something to count as trauma, you have to have experienced or witnessed the traumatic event or be exposed to traumatic information and experiences for a prolonged period of time. And this is where I think the pandemic really plays a role in trauma for everyone, really, but especially for those that we're ministering to, is we are now at the point of basically 2 years straight. That's a prolonged period of time of hearing about how many people, the infection rate, how many people have died, people who've had really extreme stories of being in and out of the hospital and are they okay, fundraisers to help families, uh, everything getting shut down and open back up again, wearing masks, not wearing masks. And so this really does add up and accumulate over time. And I'm sure you've seen all of the jokes on social media about just as the new year was coming up, people were joking about, it's almost 2022 and I'm still processing 2020. And I think there's really something to that because there is some preliminary research that suggests that people who have diagnosable PTSD, they often report a slowing of time perception during their trauma when it's going on, a slowing of time perception. So I think it will be interesting to see, 10 years from now when we can look back on this time period and really recognize how we were impacted more than maybe we realize from this event. So how do people recover? It just seems so overwhelming sometimes. So what do we do about this? How do we help people who are in the midst of their trauma or have experienced trauma at some point in their lives? There's a few things to do. Even without therapy, there are things that can be done. Definitely want to be paying attention to somebody's community. Do they have a strong friendships, friends that they can rely on and even speak to? Family supports. Do they have a strong community? Maybe perhaps in the ministry that they're participating in. Are they participating actively in prayer and in their church events? Seeking out spiritual direction or meeting with a priest or spiritual leader of some sort. Coping strategies. Do they have ways to manage those symptoms when they pop up? So if they're in the midst of having some anxiety or flashback, do they have some strategies of what to do in that moment to manage so it doesn't become overwhelming? And all of those are extremely important. One of the things we often talk about in therapy, we're constantly assessing for those social supports and those strategies and helping people to do that. And then of course I'm going to put therapy up there. I'm a therapist, but it truly is the primary means of treatment. When we're talking about trauma, this is very serious and it can be risky to dive into people's stories because we never know how someone will react. Sometimes, again, with triggering, when you're unfolding stories around someone's trauma, we never know what that moment is going to be when somebody gets triggered. Sometimes there are situations where people might experience suicidal thoughts in a triggered moment. And so we really want to be careful. And that's why therapy is so important, because you would have a trained professional knowing how to respond and help that person if they were to experience something really serious like that, some suicidal thoughts. One of the most popular forms of treatment for trauma right now is called EMDR. It's called eye movement, stands for eye movement and desensitization and reprocessing. And what it is a treatment where you can go about it two different ways. So the therapist can sort of have a pointer where somebody tracks with their eye back and forth, or you get kind of these little buzz things in your hand where it will alternate buzzing between your left and right hand. So the person in the room will hold those buzzies in their hands, and while they alternate back and forth. And what that does is it stimulates the right and left hemispheres of the brain. This is a well-researched treatment, and they've been able to find that it's something about activating the left and right hemispheres while someone is talking about their trauma. The brain has a way of healing itself. I've sat in on many EMDR sessions, and it truly is phenomenal how much healing takes place with this. So if you know of a therapist who is trained in EMDR, that would be a great resource for the families that you're ministering to. There's another form of treatment called prolonged exposure, so exposure therapy. And believe it or not, so EMDR is the more popular approach that's really kind of taken the therapy world by storm in a sense. But prolonged exposure has actually shown to be more effective over time than EMDR. I'm not trying to bash EMDR. It's still a great, very effective treatment. But prolonged exposure really spends some time talking about, again, sharing the story, getting into the details around the trauma. And again, this has to be with a trained professional, because you have to be able to gauge between when someone is ready to share and how much they can tolerate in the moment that emotional distress of going back to those traumatic memories. And so they found with prolonged exposure therapy that it's effective with 50% of patients with only 6 sessions. Only 6 sessions, effective for 50%. And then if they go to 10 to 12 sessions, it's effective with 75%. And these are 90-minute sessions. So it's really exciting. What people often don't talk about in trauma, they view it as an individual therapy experience, but in a couples context, so if you have a couple that you're ministering to and one of them has experienced severe trauma, couples therapy can be a great format for prolonged exposure treatment, because they can dialogue together and figure out how to support one another through that trauma. It's really beneficial. And I think a lot of people forget the fact that somebody who's displaying symptoms, they might have some relationships that are strained in some way. And so it would be just very natural to help strengthen and reinforce those relationships. So family therapy can be helpful for this, group therapy, and couples. And so that's a great, really helpful format to do that prolonged exposure. And medication. Medication is also very effective treatment. So usually they use some type of SSRI medication, serotonin reuptake inhibitor is what that stands for. But those are kind of the 3 top things I would say. So definitely therapy is your number one thing you're going to want to do, but also making sure somebody has those strong communities, sense of social supports, and ways to cope when those difficult moments come up for them. So what can you do? And by the way, if you have any questions, please, I'm very much would love to hear them. I know we'll have time at the end for questions, so feel free to write them down and save them for the end. I would love to hear. So what should you do about this, and what can you do? How do we support people with trauma? It's a big question. The first thing I would say is you do not have to be a therapist. These families do not need you to be a therapist, so you're totally off the hook. I'm taking that pressure off of you right now. And so part of that is knowing your role. So relief, right? You do not have to be the one sitting there holding their hand, helping them with coping strategies. So think about what your role is in that situation. Are you working at a parish? Are you working at a school? Are you in a leadership role? Are you a volunteer? Is there perhaps a chain of command to follow when a situation comes up that we need to be reporting to someone, or are we the one who's reported to? And so paying attention to what your role is going to be really valuable in knowing what is that next step I should take as far as offering someone support. The next thing, you want to get people connected to resources. So whether it is a parent, whether it is a the child themselves, maybe you have to make a call to Child and Protective Services or refer to a local therapist. This is a really challenging one because a lot of people feel torn at breaking somebody's trust in that moment or bringing up an awkward conversation. How do I broach this topic of, hey, I think you might need some help, some resources, without feeling like I am judging someone or telling them they're crazy or something like that. And my belief, my opinion is that it's kind of worth it to risk the alienation for the sake of healing. And if we're paying attention to our tone and how we say things, we can come across in a very caring, loving, helpful way. It doesn't mean that people are always going to take that help, and that's okay. But at least you can say that you've done your part of trying to get somebody connected and further along on their healing journey, which is ultimately what we're all on and what we're all wanting to be, is healed and whole, so that we can live eternally with the Father in union with Him, healed and whole. And so this is part of our journey towards heaven. So you're helping somebody by doing that. And then showing that love and care and support. So like we talked about before, the community and social supports are a protective and healing factor for someone. So what we do as therapists, a lot of times when people come to visit, I want to know about who their friends are. I want to know about their family, what their relationships are like, because community plays a large role in managing trauma symptoms and in managing those symptoms well and recovering. So if you are handling all of this, you experience a trauma and you're by yourself and you have nobody to talk about it with, and you live alone and your friends are far away and you're not in touch very often, maybe you have busy schedules, that person might have a more challenging time processing and recovering from their trauma than somebody who is surrounded by a family who's banding together, got meal chain coming and friends bringing meals to the house, going to therapy. And so I say this to say, do not diminish the importance of your role. You really play a truly invaluable part. And what we do as therapists, we want to know about these community supports, because that tells me that this person has one more little advantage, one more edge to be on the way to recovery. And the person who doesn't have those community supports, I'm going to be a little bit more on high alert. I'm going to have that red flag warning of making sure that that's one of the first steps we implement, is let's get you in touch with some supports, because once we get into this trauma work, it's going to be very emotionally challenging, and we want to make sure you have somewhere to land once we start triggering and getting to those really difficult places. And so your role is so important. Showing that genuine love and care really truly does go a long way. And I don't want you to feel like that is cliche, because by any means, it truly is life-saving work for many, many people. The other important points I want to make, the difference between children and adults, and somebody mentioned this earlier, which I think is so amazing. But sometimes young people can display symptoms a little bit differently than adults. So there can be mood swings. A change in personality is a huge sign, especially for a young person. So if a child is usually outgoing and really social and all of a sudden quiet, we want to pay attention to that. If a child is really quiet and they're all of a sudden outgoing and the life of the party and center of attention, we also want to pay attention to that. Anything that is different from their normal personality. And Also, to be aware that children sort of vacillate more often between emotions. So, for example, if an adult is experiencing depressive symptoms, which can happen with trauma, with PTSD, um, that's sort of the cliche. They're laying on the couch eating a tub of ice cream. You can't get out of bed. That's sort of the generic stereotype of how depression looks. It doesn't always look like that, but that is even less likely to happen for a child. So a child might be depressed for an hour or a day, and then their friends call them and they want to go out. They want to go hang out with their friends, and then they're fine. Or they're playing with the neighbor kids outside and having a great time, and they come in and they're sad and depressed. And so it's important to be aware of those differences, because sometimes as adults we can talk ourselves out of things like, oh, they're fine. They were just playing outside. They're not depressed. That's crazy, because we have the vision of the couch eating the tub of ice cream in our minds. But for kids, it's a little bit different. So we want to pay attention to those differences. And then making sure we have the proper disposition when we're ministering to people as well. So I used to work in one of the diocesan high schools here in Orlando, and I was the mental health counselor on campus. So they had, school counselors, guidance counselors, and then they had me sort of working with the mental, emotional needs of the students. And there was two students that sort of came to mind as I was putting this presentation together. One was an individual who had experienced trauma, and it was well known in the community. So this was a situation that was in the news, and everyone obviously felt a lot of love and compassion for this young person. But what happened was, we'd be in academic support meetings for this individual, and teachers would be saying, whatever we have to do, we just have to get them through. They have to pass. That was so horrible, and we don't want anything more damaging to happen to this individual. And it was very striking to me in that moment, because first of all, little did they know how many other individuals in that school also had experienced something very similar to that young person. They just knew about this one young individual because it was public and in the news some years back. But there were many other students who I was aware of and I had met with who had also experienced similar traumas that the teachers were not aware of at all. So when we think about fairness and treating people equally, that's something to pay attention to. The other piece was, this young person I felt like their dignity was stripped away in a sense. They got that label of that trauma that they experienced, and they didn't seem to have any confidence in themselves. They weren't given the opportunity to struggle, to work hard academically, to know that they could succeed. They just sort of were passed along because everyone loved and cared about them, supported them, which was great. But they were coming at it in a way that wasn't ultimately helpful to them and wasn't setting them up and preparing them for adulthood, which was coming in just a few very short years. And so I think we need to pay attention to our dispositions. Even though we're moved with compassion, we have to think about ultimately what is going to be helpful for that individual. Another student that I worked with, she had mentioned, some anxiety symptoms, having some severe anxiety. So she went to the dean and she asked, can I can't do this speech. I have anxiety, from a speech class, is there a way I can get out of that? And the dean very kindly said, oh, yes, of course, absolutely, but talk to Regina first. And, but that's fine with me. Just make sure it's okay with her. So when she came to me, I said, here's the problem. We need to know from your therapist or your psychiatrist, whoever it is that you're working with, we need to know that if you were to give this speech, that this is something that's going to inhibit your treatment, that's going to make you regress, that's going to be severely traumatic to you. Because again, there are lots of students in this school who experience anxiety and live with those symptoms, and yet they find a way to still get their assignments done. And so we have to be very careful, because we want to make sure our young people are able to go into the world and live and navigate the world that still happens regardless of what they're experiencing. Certainly, they might have to work a lot harder. And I mean, some of the people I work with are the strongest people I know because of all the extra steps they have to take to do what so many other people do so easily and flawlessly without thinking about it. And so we have to make sure that our love and our care and concern is disposed in a way that ultimately is going to be helpful and honoring their dignity and letting them know that they are still very capable, even though they have these symptoms that they experience as well. So these are a few resources for you. I really love these national hotlines. So there's the suicide prevention hotline. These are 24/7, every 365, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, someone will answer and help a child or a family member, or you could even call yourself on behalf of someone else. Whenever I give a talk to young people, I tell them to put that crisis text line in their phones so that they can either help a friend if a friend starts texting them and saying, I'm thinking about hurting myself or whatever it is, they have that resource available to them. And then SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Association of America, they have a national helpline as well that can help with referrals for substance abuse, but also for mental health in general. And then I put the Florida line down there because I know we're in all different places, but here in Florida, we have our own crisis hotline called 211. So somebody can call and it's a resource line. You can call and find out, where can I have a mobile team be sent to assess if somebody's safe or do they need to be hospitalized? Where can I find a food pantry? Where can I find whatever resource we need? So it's worth doing an online search in your state and seeing what resources are available to you. So if you were to just search crisis hotline or helpline in your state, there probably is something available to you there as well. So that's worth checking out. So we're kind of low on time, I'm seeing, but I want to just do this quick little reflection activity here of responding to COVID. So this is a recap of thinking about what your role is. So how would you help a young person or the people you're ministering to respond? What is your role in this situation dealing with COVID right now? Are you the leader? Are you a volunteer? Are you the DRE, core team, parish ministry leader? What are the needs and resources for those people that you're ministering to, whether they're teens, married couples, premarital, RCIA? What are the needs? Do they need more social time? Do they need a sense of safety, structure, routine, consistency, for example, for young people? What type of love do people need? Do they even need tough love sometimes? What are the nuances, regular check-ins, different expressions of symptoms, right? We talked about the difference between children versus adults and how do we need to pay attention to. Maybe there's a child who's not comfortable feeling vocal if their parent might be the abuser or a family member might be the abuser and vice versa. Maybe there's a parent who's hiding information, not sharing everything with you because they're embarrassed about having lost a job or because they are the offender in that situation. And so there's a lot of pressure and things that happen in families that we are not aware of. And then 5, what's the appropriate disposition? How can you honor that person's dignity? So just because they're going through a hard time does not mean you lower your standards or change your approach. So take a moment to reflect on those questions, specifically with COVID. If you'd like, you can put them in the question box. You don't have to, but thinking about how you would respond based on what we've talked about today.
So we've got some responses and we've had some questions. So if that's okay with you, I'll just kind of move into that part.
Sure. I just have
Q&A.
one more thing to share, but
Okay.
yeah, go ahead. Let's go ahead.
Okay. Okay.
We're good. Hmm.
Um, so first of all, when you talked about the EMDR, can you clarify what the D and the R stands for?
Yes, desensitization and reprocessing.
Okay. Desensitization and reprocessing. And somebody asked here, does that work with individuals in shutdown or maybe freeze?
Freeze, you mean like if they're shutting down?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, so the absolutely the EMDR therapists are trained in again knowing the appropriate timing of when to visit a situation with someone, how to set it up to make sure that you have all the coping skills. And even if you were to become overwhelmed or frozen in the moment of processing that trauma, they absolutely know how to take a step back and make sure you're calm before proceeding forward. Yeah, any trauma, even just not EMDR, but any trauma informed therapist would be aware of how important that is. Absolutely.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. A couple
Mhm.
of comments here in regards to this activity. One person says, I'm a teacher in a high school in Fort Lauderdale, recognizing and checking in with students when I sense something is wrong.
Yes, yes. Yeah,
Yes.
sometimes teachers are some of the first people that students will share things to. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
invaluable.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Another response, always asking what their needs are seems to be a good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't hurt to ask. Sometimes it's really great to just be direct and transparent and really helpful.
Hmm.
Sometimes people don't always know what they need, but for those that do, absolutely ask them.
Yeah, I imagine it could start a conversation or open up that conversation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then somebody asks here, do we solicit information or wait for the person to open up?
That is a great question. I think it depends on your relationship with them. So, how well established is your relationship? Is there a sense of trust? Is this somebody that you feel like they would be receptive to you speaking into that? And if the answer is yes, then certainly I think it'd be okay to ask. Again, out of care and concern, in an appropriate setting, and all following parish guidelines and communication
Hmm.
guidelines with young people, all of
Right.
that. Um, but at the same time, they can reject that. They can say no, thank you. They can not want to share, and that is okay. That doesn't mean that you did anything wrong, but somebody just might be in a place where they're not ready or wanting to share. Maybe it can be very scary to talk about some of those things. It can be very challenging emotionally, and so they just might not feel ready to talk about it. Or worried about potential consequences if they do share, especially in an abuse situation. And so I wouldn't want you to feel like if somebody doesn't share that you did something wrong. It's just they just might not be ready, and that's okay too. And that's why resources can come in handy. Maybe they might not call that therapist that week or that day, but they might call a year from when you gave it to them. So you never know.
Yes. Another person said, listening with compassion and empathy, just being there, accompanying them.
Yes, huge fan of listening and empathy. I'm a huge fan of that. It truly is important and goes back to that support that you offer. It's really invaluable.
Hmm. Can you speak to the difficulty of balancing caring listening with not sliding into them expecting therapy from me?
Ooh, yes. Okay. So, I would think of it, I would view it the same way you would speaking to a friend or family member, a close friend, right? So when we're having an intimate conversation with a friend, and I understand still understand there's a professional boundary here, right? But when you're hanging out with a friend over coffee or at your house and they're opening up and sharing about something that's challenging to them, we don't think, oh my gosh, am I doing therapy right now? This is horrible. They're showing their emotions. it's just a conversation. You're being a friend, you're listening, you're supporting, you're validating. And that is okay and very necessary in ministry because we are accompanying people, we're journeying alongside them. And the same way Jesus did so many people, how can we have a relationship with someone who's not willing to journey with us in the good times and the bad and answer our questions? And so it, just because someone opens up to you does not mean make that therapy. But certainly, if there was somebody who was continually coming to you on a regular basis and asking for advice and support, and they were kind of checking in regularly, that could be a sign that you would want to direct them to someone else, that this is sort of beyond just, hey, I'm having a moment and can I talk about it? So that, I think that would be the biggest distinction, is if they're consistently coming to you and talking about it on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So we've got some high school teachers on with us today, and one has asked, how do you create a community support? You were talking about you want to know from your clients what kind of community support they have. What could a teacher do to try to create that support in the classroom or the high school setting?
Yeah, I think the classroom is a great place. Is your classroom an environment where students feel comfortable, relaxed? Obviously, not so relaxed they don't behave and listen to the lesson, but they know that you respect them and you value them as individuals that have opinions. That was kind of my advantage when I was in the high school, was I got to hear about what the students thought of all the teachers. So and so, she's tough, but I learn a lot, or this person, we never get anything done, or this person really listens to me, I know they care about me. So the students know, if you're treating them with respect, and that's going to open up the door should something come down the line, that they know in their mind who's the teacher I would want to talk to if something were to come up. So I think just in your everyday interactions, of being kind really goes a long way. And then I would also connect with those school counselors, those guidance counselors, because I'm pretty confident they have some resources for you, that they're facilitating some opportunities for some students that you could maybe make announcements and let students know about in the class as well.
Absolutely. So we're getting a lot of comments here about thanking you for this helpful information, and how so many are wanting to accompany and support their students or their families who are mourning loss, mourning family members, especially as victims of COVID, and the need to nurture them. Excellent presentation, lots of solid information. One of the top 5 offered. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Regina. If you want to maybe continue and finish up.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I just wanted to share, some things that we have coming up that I think could be helpful resources for you all. So you see that QR code there. For those who are not familiar with QR codes, just hold your phone up to the screen, take a picture, open up your camera app, take a picture of that QR code. It will send you a link. So I have some stress and anxiety program coming up probably by the end of February. It's going to be an 8 to 10 week program where people can learn some very tangible coping strategies of what to do. So if they have some goals of how they want to manage stress and make sure they're in control versus anxiety and stress having control over them, there's accountability there. It's going to be really fun. I'm really excited about this. So if you have anyone you're ministering to who you think could benefit from that stress and anxiety coaching, feel free to send them that link and that resource. And then also on January 31st, I'm doing a Catholic Couples Love Adventure Challenge. We did this last year, so this is the second go around. It's a 7-day challenge. It's totally free. We got an amazing response, but every day we focus on a different topic. So if you have premarital couples or married couples, again, you're ministering to, or if you yourself want to jump in, you're more than welcome. but we talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse of a relationship. What are those things that lead to divorce? We talk about communication, sexual intimacy, emotional intimacy, and there's activities each day. So you get a workbook, and then there's activities each day based on the theme we talk about for each of those days, the 7 days that you as a couple can sort of engage, participate, and deepen that aspect of your relationship. It's a lot of fun, super light. So join us on January 31st. We'll be on Instagram. I have my Instagram handle down there if you want to join at Boyd Counseling Services. So just in case, those are ways to kind of stay in touch and things that are coming up.
I will definitely share all of this in the email that goes out tomorrow for you all, in case you didn't get it all down at this point. All right. Well, thank you so much, Regina. I'm going to go ahead and take back presenter mode here real quick.
Thank you.
Yes, this was really so helpful and so hopeful too. I think really giving people some information that they can, deal with their own stress in their own lives, but also especially care for those in their lives that they minister to, from the schools to the parishes. I know there's a lot of concern there, and so thank you once again. We have some books that could also help you in your ministry that I will share with you in the email tomorrow. But this promo code here, webinar 0118, is for 25% off your entire order at avemariapress.com. There are a few exclusions, of course, but we'll cover most of the resources. If you have any questions about anything, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to help. And I invite you to join us next week. I guess if you are Spanish speaking, we're going to have a webinar that will be just in Spanish. We have a series for Spanish ministers. And so Andres Arango is one of the authors. And so he's going to be talking about how to reflect Jesus as we grow in our personal relationship with God, talking about some key expressions of faith in the spirituality of Hispanics in the U.S. So we invite you to join us or share this with somebody who might have this interest. Once again, thank you everybody for sharing this hour with us. Regina, thank you. As always, this was wonderful, and I look forward to seeing you all in the future. Take care. Have an excellent day. Bye-bye.